Hello there, and welcome to this edition of Citizen Academy's Expert Knowledge Series. If you enjoyed the Expert Knowledge Series on the Star Citizen economy, you're in for a special treat, because in this video we're going to be discussing main servers, instance servers, physics grids, and zones. Now, I fully realize that for a lot of you, when you get into a conversation with somebody about an instance in Star Citizen, your eyes immediately begin to glaze over and you start dozing off. But fear not, for I am going to make this video fun for you to watch and, more importantly, very easy to understand. At least, that's what I'm hoping for. So, let's get right into it, shall we? First, let's talk about one of the problems that lots of online games have. Now, online multiplayer games oftentimes have limits as to how many people can play the game on a particular server at any one time. The greater the fidelity or level of detail in objects in the environment, as well as a sheer number of objects in that environment, the more of a data load there is on the server to process all that data for those playing the game. And what this means is that in pretty much all online games, there are many times in which there are more players wanting to be in one particular area of the game world than the main server can handle. And this is because the load of data on the server is just far too great for it to process. Now, one very common solution, for example, with World of Warcraft, is to have lots of servers host a game rather than just one, each of which is an entirely isolated server from the other. And something else that World of Warcraft does is it will break up the game's dungeon environments into something called Shards, and these are sometimes referred to as an instance. Now, a shard or instance, in very simple terms, is basically it's a small server off the main server that handles the gaming experience for a predefined number of players as one group. So, as an example, instead of a main server handling the gaming needs of, say, 50 players, 10 shards would be spun off the main server, which would handle 5 players each. In this way, the load of data on the main server is freed up a great deal. So what they're doing basically is they're spreading out the load, so to speak. Now, one problem with this shard system is that gameplay can sometimes become fragmented to some extent. For example, if you want to play online with your friends, but they are within a shard that is already filled up, well, you'll have to join a different shard. Because of this, you become isolated from them and not able to share the gaming experience with all your friends. Now, Star Citizen is going to feature a gaming environment in which everyone plays on one main server. However, the question is, how is CIG going to handle the problem of excessive server load? I mean, let's face it, in a game like Star Citizen, with incredibly detailed spaceships, authentic flight physics, really complex dogfighting, and a huge number of players online, server load is going to be a very big problem. The fact is that there is no way with current technology for one server to handle such a massive data load that Star Citizen is going to put out. Now, even if such a server did exist, there is no PC computer on the market, at least not today, that will be able to handle that much data on the player's side of things. So they got you both ways. Now, the way CIG has solved this problem, at least we hope they solve it, is to use the best features of a main server that looks after many aspects of the global gaming environment and combine that with temporary server instances that handle large groups of players, like, for example, during epic space battles, which by their very nature are great big data hogs on a server. So instead of several main servers, there will only be one server that you log into. And instead of several permanent instances, all of them will be temporary. What this means is you're never going to be stuck in one particular instance. However, you will be hopping from one instance to another for much of the time you'll be playing Star Citizen. So here is how CIG is going to solve this problem. There is going to be one great big server called the Galaxy server, which will keep track of all the players' assets. And this will be things like which ships they own, their clothing, their weapons, that sort of thing. It's also going to keep track of the exact location of every player within the Star Citizen universe. It's going to keep track of each player's relation to other players, whether they're enemies or friends, people of interest, like if you're a bounty hunter trying to find a certain person, and so on. Now, the Galaxy server is also going to run the economy model for the entire Star Citizen universe. And on top of that, it's also going to manage all of the NPC characters, which will comprise around 90% of all the characters in the Star Citizen universe. So the Galaxy server is going to have a pretty big job. The Galaxy server is not going to be involved in any massive data-intensive real-time events. As I said before, things like huge space battles. So while there is going to be a large load on the Galaxy server, it will not be as harsh as if it otherwise did have to handle all these other real-time events. And this brings up a fairly common question. And that question is, how many people are going to be able to be online playing Star Citizen at any one time? Well, because the main server, the Galaxy server, is not going to be handling any really massive, intensive, real-time events, and because all those other kind of events will be passed on to instance servers, in theory, you could have millions or billions or trillions or quadrillions of people playing Star Citizen all at the same time. And yes, I am exaggerating. From what I've read and done research on, technically, CIG can have millions of players online at the same time. So that is pretty darn impressive. Now, as far as how many people you can have in a particular instance, that is sort of a gray area. I mean, nobody really knows what the actual numbers are, but from what CIG has told us, it looks like, at least initially, it's going to be somewhere between maybe 75 to 100, maybe, at the start when Star Citizen is launched. And perhaps as the game is further developed, that number may increase. But overall, of people actually playing the game itself, that could number, at least in theory, up into like 1 million players. Now, another function of the Galaxy server is to spin off a player into an instance should that need arise. Like, for example, if a player receives a distress call from a ship being attacked by pirates. In this case, an instance will be created that includes your friend's ship and the pirates, and you will be spun off into that instance to help out your friend. And yes, granted, that is a really, really simple example. However, no matter how simple or complex a particular instance might be, there's basically a 4-step process that happens when you are spun off into an instance. First off, the Galaxy server will transfer all data about you to the instance server, where your friend is being attacked by those pesky little pirates. And this kind of information would be stuff like where you're located, information about your ship, who was on board your ship, and what are those people doing, and a whole host of other stuff that I don't need to get into. What happens next is that the instance server is going to pass data about itself to your computer. For example, where is that instance located? Which objects are within that instance? Which players are there? And what are those players doing? And so on and so on. After those first 2 steps are done, the control of your gaming experience is passed to the instance server. And at this point, you have, in effect, joined that instance. And the last step, and this is not really so much of a step, but the movement, if you can call it that, from the Galaxy server moving you to a instanced server will be totally seamless. From your point of view, when you're flying around there in space, you won't even know anything special happened. Okay, now I want to clear up a little confusion about how an instance is actually structured. Now, an instance is not assigned to a permanently specific area of space, just, for example, waiting around for you to fly into it. It is not a predefined and fixed structure. In fact, every instance is going to be extremely variable. They're going to have all different shapes, all different sizes, but they are not going to be structures that are just permanently in the Star Citizen universe of a fixed size, just sitting there waiting for you. They are going to be very dynamic, coming into existence of this size and that, and then going out of existence. Furthermore, an instance has no defined geometry in space of a certain size. So you're not going to have a predefined instance that's 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers by 50 kilometers. And yes, I know, I've been using these cool-looking transparent spheres to represent an instance, but that's just for diagrammatic purposes. So an instance server is able to spin up any size of quote-unquote space anywhere within the Star Citizen universe. And when events are no longer taking place within that instance, for example, when a space battle is all over and done with, and all the ships that have survived go home, that instance will be shut down. Now, as mentioned before, this placement into an instance will be based upon where the player is located, their skill level, which groups of players they are aligned with, and on top of that, there will also be an option to set your player versus player preferences. Okay, so what is that? Well, the PvP preference, as it's sometimes called, is an option you as a player can select to determine the ratio of interactions you would like to have with real players versus NPC characters. And this is represented with this cool-looking diagram below here. Now, one thing to keep in mind is you cannot set your preference to 100% of one or the other. Even if you set your preference to the highest NPC rating there is, you're still going to be somewhere along the line interacting with real players, just not very often. So when you're placed into an instance, this matchmaking system will try to put you within an instance that contains your friends or certain people of interest that are on your list. And this matchmaking system within Star Citizen is going to be controlled by something called a Generic Instance Manager, or GIM for short. The Generic Instance Manager is responsible for managing all the server architecture for Star Citizen. It will also, when you are placed into an instance, for example, during a space battle, try to match you up against other players that are of the same general skill level as you are. This may not always be the case, or so I've heard, but the system will try as best as can to do that. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard that eventually, when the social module is released, that you will be able to invite your friends into your hangar. Well, when events of that sort happen, an instance is going to be created inside your hangar, and the Generic Instance Manager is going to be in control of that as well. So this GIM system is something totally brand new. It's never been done before, and it's being created from scratch by CIG, and it's going to be very streamlined and a very efficient way of managing Star Citizen servers. Now, if you're all still with me, and I hope you are, let's put all this together with sort of a real-world example. Let's say you're on the planet Pike, which is in the Terra system. Lovely place, by the way. and you're there to pick up a load of platinum for shipment to Cassel in the Goss system. Now, this involves walking around a city, speaking to various vendors, negotiating prices, loading your ship with platinum, and maybe stopping by a bar afterwards for an adult beverage, chatting with some real players or NPC characters in the bar, and so on. Now, some of these events will be handled by the Galaxy server, while others would be taken care of by an instance server, like in the situation where you stroll into a bar after your work is done. That is going to be an instance inside the bar. So, after buying your cargo and loading into your ship, you launch out into space. Now, if there are other players in orbit around Pike, an instance would have already been created for them. However, if that instance is full, a new one will be created and you will be placed into that one instead. Now, as mentioned before, the Galaxy server keeps track of who you are aligned with, who your friends are, and which other players you are interested in. So, if one of the instances above the planet contains any of these players, a reserved slot for you will be created within that instance, and then you will be placed into that instance. So after launching out into orbit, you get onto your navigation computer and set course for Cassel. After engaging autopilot, you head off into the vast expanse of space. Now at this point, you've been handed back over to the Galaxy server. You're no longer in that instance above the planet. Along the way to your destination, the Galaxy server is constantly monitoring if you will be crossing paths with other hostile players, passing by a space battle, or encountering some other event or object of interest. Like, for example, an abandoned spaceship. Oh, and these red symbols here on this diagram, those represent jump points, just in case you were curious. Now, if you encounter such things along the way, you will be taken out of autopilot and placed into another instance around that object of interest. So, let's say in this example that in this area between these two jump points right here, you receive a call from a friend of yours who is being attacked by pirates. The Galaxy server will spin you off into that space battle instance, and again in that sort of a four-step process that I described just a little while ago. And when you join this instance, you can either decide to fight, or you can decide to run away like a bloody coward. Now, if you're brave, you can join the battle, but if you need help, you will be able to send out a distress call to your friends to come to your aid, or to send out a general distress call for anyone out there who might be able to help you. In order for a friend to help you, however, they would need to be on your friend's list. Now, once they reply to your call, there are two ways they can join you. The first is that they can engage their quantum drive and warp in to join you. That is, provided they are in the same area of space that you are in. And if not, they will have to navigate to your area by going through a series of jump points and then warp to your location. But in that situation, they simply may not arrive there in time. Okay, now the second way a player can join you is as part of your crew. That is, assuming you are flying a multi-crew ship. Now, in this case, the other player coming to help you would not have to be in your same general area of space. That person would just appear inside your ship and take the place of an NPC character. That is, of course, assuming you have NPCs aboard your ship. That player can now man a gun turret, control the shields, pilot your ship, or whatever sort of help you may require from that person. Now, when that event with those pesky pirates is all over with, and assuming you survived, of course, you would go back into autopilot and continue on your way to Cassel. And again, that instance is now over and done with, and you are placed back onto the Galaxy server. Once you reach Cassel, you arrange for a landing slot, and this whole landing sequence takes place also on the Galaxy server. Now, when all of that is done, you find your way to another bar in which you consume more adult beverages, chat with the locals, and perhaps arrange for another cargo hauling opportunity. Now, this part takes place in an instance server inside the bar, just like you did when you started this entire journey. So I hope I made that whole example clear, but you can see how, depending on where you are and what you are doing, you are continually shifting from being under the control of the Galaxy server and then being spun off into the control of a instance server, and then back and forth and back and forth. All right, so now let's talk about a related topic to instances. How will individual ships be handled by this system? A fine question. Well, it turns out that there are going to be local physics grids for each ship. In other words, all the players on a particular ship will exist relative to that ship. All right, let me explain what that means. When you're on a ship flying around in space, and that ship is maneuvering here and there, making all these sharp turns and maneuvers and whatnot, the players in that ship are treated as a part of the ship's own physics. So in other words, as the ship makes a sharp turn, you're not going to be seeing your characters in your ship being tossed and turned all over the place, knocking against the walls and so forth. They're actually part of the physics of that ship. Now, there is also going to be a global physics grid that exists outside of one's ship. And that is going to handle the physics of objects like space debris from spaceships that have blown up, asteroids, and also things like guns that have been shot at you from another ship or missiles that are coming in your direction. Anything that is zipping around out there in space outside of your ship will be handled by the global physics grid. And anything inside your ship will be handled again by the local physics grid. And again, that would be things like the movement of characters inside your ship. Sitting down at a table and spilling your coffee on the floor, that will be handled by the local physics grid. So this brings up another question that I see quite often, and that is, can an object from one instance interact with an object in some other instance? And the answer to that is, well, yes, they can. So let's say you're in a space battle, and somebody fires a missile at you. That missile exists in the global physics grid. If that missile impacts your ship, the local grid of your ship is going to react to that impact. And what happens in that case is the data from that projectile is simply passed from the global grid to the local grid inside your ship. So you can think of it as information being moved from one instance over here to another instance over there. In fact, you can sort of think of these grids as a specialized type of instance that handles the physics of various objects. But perhaps this is not an entirely accurate way of describing these physics grids. And the reason why these grids are being set up is that having a server manage the physics of various objects is a pretty complex process. But what this sets up is, it sets up a sort of hierarchy. For example, there is a dense cluster of objects that obey the laws of physics inside of your ship, whereas outside of your ship, well, it's mostly just black emptiness. So there are only a few objects that need to obey the laws of physics relative to your ship, that is. So it's much more efficient to have sort of a specialized type of physics grid handle the really tough stuff, while you have a more generalized physics grid, the global physics grid, handle the less dense, maybe easier to handle stuff. It's just a more efficient way of spreading out the load. Now, something else that CIG is working on is something called the zone system. And what you can do is you can think of these zones as nested instances. So, for example, a player can be inside their spaceship's cargo bay zone, which is nested inside the more generalized spaceship zone, and that in turn is nested inside of a planetary zone in orbit around a planet. And again, like those physics grids I just mentioned, This sets up a very efficient structure for handling data. So, for example, when a ship is moving from point A to point B, only the location of the ship's zone needs to be recalculated. The various zones within that ship and all the characters inside the ship and everything that they're doing and all the other objects inside the ship, they don't need to be recalculated for a player observing that ship from a distance to know what's going on. All you need to know as an observer is this ship's zone was here, now it is over there. So again, like the physics grids, this system of nested zones guarantees that only the data that actually needs to be processed by a server will be processed. And as I mentioned before, this is something that some other online games don't do. They just process everything all the time. Not so with Star Citizen. Much more lean, mean, and efficient way of doing things. And finally, let's talk about level of detail and ship rendering, because this relates directly to server load. Now, the insides of spaceships are perhaps the most complex part of any object in Star Citizen. They require the most network synchronization, they require the most server load, and they require the most from your computer at home. And processing all this data about all these finely detailed ships has the potential of creating a bottleneck in the flow of the game. And we don't want none of that. Now, CIG is trying to solve this problem in a pretty clever way. So as I just mentioned, if you're in your spaceship and you're looking at a huge multi-cruise ship quite a distance away, the only details of that ship being rendered would be those you can actually see. Like, for example, the surface of the ship and maybe inside the cockpit. But that's it. All the other data of events going on inside that ship will be disregarded by the servers. That is, from your point of view. Now, such data will, of course, naturally be rendered for those who are inside that ship, but not for you. Again, because you don't need to know that stuff. And again, this is a bit different from the way the other guys do it. I mean, some other online games, as I mentioned before, are continuously updating all of this data, even if such objects can't even be seen by the other players. So, that's a pretty inefficient way to do things. So during a space battle, only the action of a ship's weapons and the ship as an entity itself will be considered when acting with another spaceship. So even at that level, you as an observer trying to shoot down some other person's ship, that's all you're really going to see, because that's all you need to see. You need to lock on your weapons and fire and blow the crap out of that ship, and that's it. However, if a hole is blasted into the hull of a giant ship, then the instance outside of the ship would be told that it now needs to render that exposed area inside the ship's instance, and to send that data to those players outside who can see it. So the interaction between one instance and another is going to be fairly open and flexible. Also, you need to consider that nearly all of space is black, so rendering that is fairly easy to do. A relatively small amount of the Star Citizen universe will actually contain complex objects, and most of those objects, like, for example, spaceships, are going to be far away from you as a player, at least most of the time. Therefore, the rendering of objects in many situations would not be such a massive load on the servers. It is only when a player gets really close to another spaceship or is involved in a massive space battle that the server load gets really intensive. So to help alleviate this server load problem, CIG is creating all ships and space stations and other objects with a whole lot of levels of details for each object. And this is something that lots of other online games do as well. Now, each of these levels of detail, or LODs, will be presented to the player based upon that player's distance from the other ship. The further away you are, the less detailed version of that ship will be presented to you. And the closer that ship is to you, the more detail will be shown by way of rendering more and more polygons on the surface of that ship to represent more and more detail. All right, let's get down to the summary. The advantages of this entire system that I've discussed are: you can customize your Star Citizen experience as a player. You can play the game as a solo pilot, play with your friends, play with NPC characters most of the time, and with real players less frequently, and so on. Another advantage is that this method of network architecture does not slice up Star Citizen into a large group of cloned universes in which groups of players are forever isolated from one another. Because, as I've mentioned several times, all players will exist on the Galaxy server. Also, your time spent within a particular instance will always be a temporary thing. Also, you will nearly always be able to invite your friends to come and join you in all your space-faring adventures. And finally, this is a very sleek and efficient manner of network management, especially for an online game of Star Citizen's scope and magnitude. Well, there you go. I hope I didn't put you guys to sleep. I tried to make this sort of entertaining and also educational. And with a little luck, you feel pretty comfortable on what instancing is all about. If you have anything you would like to say, please leave me a comment. I'm always very interested in reading your comments and replying to them. And if you really want to show support for my channel, please click on that little red subscribe button down below there. Until next time, this is Citizen Academy, wishing all of you fame and fortune in the verse.